The Stone Zone with legendary Republican strategist and political icon and pundit Roger Stone. Stone has served as a senior campaign aide to 3 Republican presidents. He is a New York Times best-selling author and a longtime friend and advisor of President Donald Trump. As an outspoken libertarian, Stone has appeared on thousands of broadcasts, spoken at countless venues, and lectured before the prestigious Oxford Political Union and the Cambridge Union Society. Due to his 4+ decades in the political and cultural arena, Stone has become a pop culture icon. And now, here's your host, Roger Stone.
Good evening and welcome to the Stone Zone with Roger Stone. I am not Roger Stone. I am Mark Vargas, editor-in-chief of Illinois Review, filling in for Roger Stone tonight. Roger will be back tomorrow. But what's the Stone Zone without getting a little bit of love from Roger Stone? We're going to tune into this clip of an interview that Roger recently gave. Is Trump making America like Florida? Let's take a look.
I don't think anybody ever falls out permanently with Donald Trump. I mean, there may be 1 or 2 exceptions to that, but really not. I mean, in his view, everybody is redeemable at some point. I think he and Rubio grew close during the Trump presidency because they were working together on Venezuela and on Cuba and on other issues in which they're both interested.
Hello and welcome to the Americano show. I am delighted to be joined today by Roger Stone, the long-time political consultant and operator of what some call the dark arts in American politics. And he is also a Floridian resident. Roger, I say that you're a resident in Florida because that's what I want to talk to you about today. Is something that I'm very interested in, which is the growing power of Florida on the American right. Because looking at the Trump appointments so far, you have several Florida figures taking very powerful roles. You have Susie Wiles, who is chief of staff. You have Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. You have Matt Gaetz possibly coming in as Attorney General. You have Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor. From this side of the Atlantic, it looks a little bit to me like a Florida takeover. Am I seeing things?
Well, first of all, let's kind of start with Susie Wiles. I mean, Susie Wiles is an enormously capable woman. There was a huge amount of second guessing of her during the campaign, all of it unfounded. She has a unique relationship with the president. Those who want to say, "Oh, she's not sufficiently conservative," or "she's not a MAGA," don't really understand her history. She first came to the attention of the president because she ran Rick Scott's campaign for governor. Rick Scott was an outsider businessman, not the choice of the Republican establishment by any means, won a smashing victory. That brought her to the attention of Donald Trump. In 2016, she could have gone to work for Marco Rubio's presidential campaign, or a guy you may not remember, Jeb Bush. You don't see his name too much in the news anymore. But she chose to go to work for for Donald Trump. She eked out a very narrow victory in Florida here in 2016. It was much closer than I think people expected. Then she went on to work for Ron DeSantis. DeSantis really owes his governorship entirely to Donald Trump. He was running at 8% in the polls, having trouble raising money. Every single one of the 62 Florida Republican county chairmen, every Republican legislature in both houses, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, every member of the congressional delegation, with the exception of Matt Gaetz, had endorsed his opponent, Adam Putnam, the agriculture commissioner, who was a former congressman. And Donald Trump's tweeted endorsement literally catapulted this guy to the nomination. Now, Florida politics, including those with these new appointments, are somewhat clouded for reasons that I don't really understand. Ron DeSantis, while he gave a tepid endorsement to the president, really did nothing to help him win this election, didn't appear at any of the Florida rallies. He had a unique opportunity to kind of fix things, but he chose not to do so. Now, he, of course, assuming that Marco Rubio, who is a good friend of mine and an excellent U.S. Senator, he's very strong in this hemisphere on the question of communism in Venezuela and Cuba. Our views are a little different on some issues, but I think he understands his job now is to implement Donald Trump's policies rather than his own, and he's quite able. He's a good man. But his seat will now, of course, be vacated, and Governor DeSantis will have the ability to appoint somebody to that seat. Now, there's a lot of speculation that Lara Trump would be a great senator, and she would, but there's no reason whatsoever to believe that Governor DeSantis would be inclined to appoint her. I think he covets this seat himself. The history in America of governors appointing themselves to Senate vacancies has a zero success rate. It has never worked. He could have a lieutenant governor whose name even I can't remember, and I live here. He could appoint her. He could step down and let her become governor, in which case she would appoint him. Voters hate that, by the way. They hate it. They think they should have some involvement in this process. So that's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. My guess is DeSantis will appoint a caretaker, someone who will fill the balance of the term, but then not run for re-election, and perhaps he will run in the primary for that seat. He's got a lot of great choices. I mean, Congressman Byron Donalds would be an excellent appointee. Congressman Corey Mills would be an excellent appointee. The state CFO, Jimmy Petronis, would be an excellent appointee. He's got a lot of great choices. Remains to be seen what he will do. The appointment of Matt Gaetz comes out of left field. I must say I'm very surprised. Matt he's kind of like me. He's a firebrand. He tells you what he really thinks. He's more interested in getting things done than he is in making friends. He's never tried a case in court that I know of, although he's certainly an attorney, and nobody can doubt his brilliance. I mean, he's a brilliant political strategist, and he's a very fine legislator. There's a missing piece here for me. Maybe I'm just not up to date. I do think his confirmation could be problematic. He's very, very controversial. But Trump is committed. This is not going to be a go along to get along administration. It's not going to be anything like 2016. Here's how it kind of works, at least in American politics. If you're an outsider, as Trump still is, first they try to destroy you. Then when they can't destroy you and you're elected, then they try to co-opt you from the inside. I don't think that's going to be successful this time as it was last time, only because the president has a lot more knowledge now about how the system works. Mike Waltz, another excellent appointee, combat veteran. The good news is that any of these seats that are being vacated will be held by the Republicans. They're all dependable Republican districts. So we have to kind of see how it plays out. But yes, I think there's a disproportionate number of Floridians. Also, should mention that President Trump at least tacitly supported Rick Scott in the contest for Senate Majority Leader. Now, unfortunately, that decision was made by the Republican caucus. I'm afraid Senator Scott found out the hard way the difference between a caucus and a cactus. You see, in a cactus, all the pricks are on the outside.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that answer. Just on the Gaetz business, there's some speculation that that very loss of Scott as Senate Majority Leader and the elevation of John Thune, that Trump was reacting to that with the Gaetz announcement, almost throwing Thune an early challenge. Do you think there might be something in that?
I don't see it that way. I think that Matt was selected, first of all, because he has intimate knowledge of the Russian collusion hoax. Now, the Democrats keep saying it's retribution or it's revenge. No, it's justice. If John Brennan, uh, who clearly asked British and New Zealand and Canadian uh, intelligence to begin monitoring uh, Trump friends and allies and supporters so that he would have deniability. Um, why is the CIA director spying on friends of the Republican candidate for president? That's just the beginning. The Russian collusion hoax. The claim, for example, that the Russians hacked the DNC uh, and that information somehow made its way to WikiLeaks is just false. There's no evidence of that. In my own trial, the FBI admitted that they had never inspected the computer servers of the DNC, and they relied entirely on a report from a company called CrowdStrikes. Uh, the judge denied my defense a copy of their report in my trial, but it was later declassified, and the president of CrowdStrikes, Sean Henry, who just coincidentally happened to be Robert Mueller's deputy at the FBI, admitted under oath before the House Intelligence Committee that his report had no such proof, that there is no proof that the Russians hacked the DNC. In fact, uh, I wanted to introduce expert testimony and forensic evidence in which I could have proved there was no online hack, but the judge, of course, would not allow that. So the point, I guess, is that I do think that Matt Gaetz, as Attorney General, is going to examine the role of certain high-level government officials in the Obama administration, such as John Brennan, such as James Comey, such as Susan Rice, as well as the actions of Adam Schiff. You see, unfortunately for Senator Schiff, no one is above the law, not even him.
Let's go back a little bit back onto Susie Wiles, because what you were talking about there and her relationship with Ron DeSantis is very interesting. The kind of reporting I've read is that there was some falling out between perhaps Casey DeSantis, Ron DeSantis' wife, and Susie Wiles, and that breakdown between DeSantis and Wiles ended up really hurting DeSantis, and Susie Wiles came out okay from it.
Well, first of all, Susie has been very circumspect about the reason why Ron DeSantis went out of his way. He didn't just fire her; he tried to destroy her. I mean, he not only canceled her contract working for the Republican State Committee, he canceled her contract working for his political action committee. He canceled her. He persuaded then campaign manager Brad Parscale to cancel her contract working on the president's reelection. He pressured the lobbying firm that she worked for. And by the way, no, she's never, ever represented Pfizer or any pharmaceutical company. That's a canard that bounces around the United States. Susie, who is, by nature, been a friend of mine for 30 years. We go back to the Reagan campaign together. We both worked for Jack Kemp, the legendary New York congressman. She's been very circumspect about that. Now, if you go back and look at the clippings, there's a piece on this, I think in the Wall Street Journal, that's incorrect. There was no one who would stand up and defend Susie Wiles at the time. No one, however, except for me, because she's a woman of enormous talent and enormous integrity. Yeah, I do think that gave her unique insights into the personalities of Ron and his rather overbearing and self-important wife. I think that contributed to his ignominious defeat in the Iowa caucuses, the rest of the presidential process.
Let's talk about Florida more broadly or generally, or in historical terms, perhaps. We've seen perhaps Texas have such a big influence over Washington with the Bushes. Do you think that's a comparable situation to what is going on now with Florida, as in terms of the state exerting quite a lot of power over Washington?
Well, I think it's really important to understand that Florida didn't even essentially have a Republican Party until the late 1950s. This was a one-party state. We the Democrats here were obviously quite conservative. The Conservative Party had two wings. It had a conservative wing and it had a liberal wing, but there really was no Republican Party here until the late 50s. Uh, I'm ready to concede now. Wasn't sure in 2022. DeSantis won a 22-point victory. But I argue to you, if we had not had a hurricane in the 3 weeks before the election, in which Governor DeSantis was able to command all media attention, and frankly, to give him credit, was, I think, very effective at moving state resources around quickly to help the state recover, rebuild bridges, and he did an excellent job. I can't take that away from him. But his opponent, Charlie Crist, who had been a Republican governor, then an independent Senate candidate, and then a Democrat congressman. One of my favorite jokes is a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent walked into a bar, and the bartender said, "Hi, Charlie." Anyway, he is a great politician in his own right, but he was depending very much on free media coverage. And of course, he got none because of the hurricane and DeSantis's role. So that big win, I thought, was an anomaly. In other words, I believed then that this is really a purple state. It's not as reliably Republican as people may think. This last election may have disproved that, because Donald Trump now becomes the second statewide candidate to carry Miami-Dade County, which is, I still think, the largest county in the state. If it's not first, it's second. And it's habitually, we've done well there. There's a large number of Republicans there. You have to reach your goal level, but the county has always gone for the Democrat candidate. DeSantis broke through there. He carried it in the governor's race. Trump carried it in this race. So perhaps the state is becoming more reliably Republican. Also, deep inroads among Hispanics. Now, in the past, that has been limited largely to Cuban Americans, to some extent to Venezuelan Americans. But this time, Trump won among Puerto Rican Americans, who are, generally speaking, more located in the central part of the state. So I think Florida may be on its way to becoming a red state, and therefore will play a disproportionate role in national Republican politics.
And there's someone called Philip Blump, I think it is the name, or Bump maybe, who wrote a book called The Aftermath, which is about the demography of Florida and how Florida looks now a bit like he anticipates America will look in 2060. You have a very large older population, you have a growing Hispanic population, very significant Hispanic population, you have a large African American population. And so therefore the fact that Trump seems to have won this new multiracial coalition, or formed in many ways this new multiracial coalition, bodes quite well, one would think, for the future of the American right.
I'm unfamiliar with the book. If you speak of Philip Bump of the Washington Post,
Yeah, I think I do,
which sounds unlikely, well, then nothing he's ever written is true or accurate. He's a guy who told us that there was never any legitimate claim against Bill Clinton regarding sexual harassment or rape, which I've written a best-selling book that proves that's wrong.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Anyway,
I was talking about Philip Bump. I'm sorry. Yeah, I won't mention his name in your presence again. But it's quite an interesting point about the demographics, is it not?
The demographics are shifting. And remember, we have a very large number of what we call snowbirds, the people who moved here from the Midwest and the Northeast, who disproportionately, I think, bring their Republican politics with them, but also key Democrat constituencies like Jewish voters, like Hispanic voters, they're also moving right. They're moving towards the Republican Party. So I think the state is on its way to being a reliably Republican state. Trump only won here in 2016 by, I believe, 2 points. And it was far more comfortable in this most recent race. He also won it in 2020 by a comfortable margin. So I think we're on our way to being a red state.
What about look at something like the Gates family? I don't believe they originally are from Florida, are they? I mean, I know he was born in Florida, but are they from Dakota originally?
That I'm uncertain of, but of course, Matt Gates' father was the president of the Florida State Senate, which is an immensely powerful position, really more powerful, certainly, than the lieutenant governor. And he's from a largely military district in North Florida, sometimes referred to as the Redneck Riviera. Uh, and he is unassailable in that district. Kevin McCarthy tried to mount an internal party challenge to him, and of course he was crushed. Look, Matt is a firebrand. He's a bit of a loner. I think there's a plan here that I may not be clued in on. Uh, I suspect it's because Matt has a huge amount of courage, and the president. It's not revenge. It's justice. People who engaged in treasonous activity, if a grand jury agrees, they should face consequences. Chris Matthews may remember said, "Well, Trump is going to put reporters up against a wall and shoot them." That's ridiculous. Although I could put forward some names where that idea might be titillating, it's not in the president's plan whatsoever. Uh, Look, a campaign in which your final message is Trump is Hitler and everybody who's voting for him is a Nazi, that's not very uplifting or inspiring. That's not a message to close a presidential campaign on. I'm still scratching my head about what Barack Obama and the Democrats were thinking in this most recent election.
Yes, and tell me about the Democratic Party in Florida. I mean, it obviously is in retreat. But as you've said, as you've argued on the last time you came on this podcast, Florida still has the potential to be a purple state if handled differently.
Yeah, the Democrat Party here, and I have some friends in the party, but they really have no bench, uh, and they the problem here, of course, is that although Florida may not be a Republican state, I think it is a conservative state overall. And unfortunately, conservative Democrat is an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. In fact, moderate Democrats don't exist in this state. So any statewide primary, unfortunately for them, produces a candidate who's too far out of the mainstream to win statewide. And I think that's their largest problem. You take John Morgan, the very prominent trial attorney, who's I think still nominally a Democrat. There's always been some discussion about drafting him to run for governor as a Democrat. Some have suggested that even he, and he's a moderate guy, but some say even he is too conservative to win a statewide Democrat primary. He could be a self-funder if he chose to be. He's a great fellow, by the way, a good friend of mine. But I'm not sure somebody like John Morgan, if he were to choose to run, could get nominated in the Democrat Party. So they have that additional problem that their party primary process will always produce somebody who I think is too left of center to win statewide.
And in terms of Marco Rubio and comparing Marco Rubio, his appointment to the Gates appointment, I shouldn't say appointment, sorry, him being picked and Matt Gates being picked. Rubio, to me, and certainly people in British politics, much more comfortable with a figure like Rubio. They regard him as much more favourable towards NATO, kind of on board with the way defence establishments think in DC and Westminster. Whereas someone like Gates, really makes the political class, the transatlantic political class, if you like, makes them tear their hair out.
Well, the key thing, of course, to understand is that I think they're both very able men, but I think they both understand that they will be carrying out the policies of Donald Trump. So, uh, despite the fact that Rubio, who's been very hard line on communism in this hemisphere, Venezuela and Cuba and so on, worked very closely with President Trump during his term on those issues, is a bit more, might be viewed as a bit more of a neocon. But I don't think that matters. Donald Trump is going to control policy in his administration. And I think he is avoiding the appointment of cabinet members and others who think that their real job is to dilute or slow down or derail the America First agenda. So I think Marco Rubio and the president have an excellent relationship. In my own case, when my wife was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, uh, Senator Rubio's office was extraordinarily helpful to us in terms of getting her access to to an experimental program at NIH, which I think may have saved her life. He's been very helpful to me just on constituent service matters. When things get tangled in bureaucracy, nothing controversial or improper, of course, but he's an excellent senator. He's very popular. I think he's going to do a great job for the president, but he understands who's in charge. You didn't have this in the last administration. That's why you got people like General John Kelly, who claims that the president praised Hitler, but he suddenly remembered it 2 weeks before the election. And there are no witnesses. Leads me to believe that it never actually happened, of course. Or H.R. McMaster. These guys told people that that their job was to slow Trump down, dilute his agenda. Look, Donald Trump, who I've known for 45 years, he's his own man. Nobody tells him who he can see and who he can't see, who he can call and who he can't call, who he can appoint, and who he cannot appoint. He's he's not a politician. There's no other way to put it. He's the head of a political movement, but he's not a politician. He'll never be a politician. He's inquisitive. He works the phone like Lyndon Johnson. I mean, he's soliciting advice from many, many, many people. Now, it doesn't mean he doesn't always take all of their advice, makes his own decisions, but it's not for lack of input. I mean, he gets a lot of input from a lot of people. Those who are smart enough to not to say, "Oh, the president called me and asked me about X, Y, and Z." But he's very much his own man. Rubio understands that. Rubio is going to do a very able job for the president, but he's going to be representing the president's policies, not his policies.
It also suggests, does it not, that Donald Trump is quite willing to forgive and forget, because there can be no denying, can there, that in 2016 the animosity between Trump and Rubio was intense and real? Or am I overreading that? Does Trump actually just regard this as just part and parcel of public politics?
No, I actually think that you've hit it on the head. I don't think anybody ever falls out permanently with Donald Trump. I mean, there may be one or two exceptions to that, but really not. I mean, in his view, everybody is redeemable at some point. And I think he and Rubio grew close during the Trump presidency because they were working together on Venezuela and on Cuba and on other issues in which they're both interested. I mean, I know a little bit about politics. I don't understand why Governor DeSantis, who owes his governorship to Donald Trump, and if it weren't for Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis would be managing a McDonald's someplace here today, and I'm not sure he could handle that. But he owes his governorship to Donald Trump. Okay, so he ran against him. So be it. But he had ample opportunity to repair that. He could have hit the road and campaigned hard for Donald Trump. There was a great rally in Doral early in the campaign. I was there. The president called me out publicly, which I was very proud of. But he didn't show up. Why would you not repair your relationships. It's kind of vexing because Trump has no permanent enemies. Well, other than maybe Adam Schiff, uh, and anybody who understands him understands that he's reasonable, and sure, he falls out with people from time to time, but generally speaking, everybody can be redeemed as long as you treat them fairly. So I think they built a great relationship, Marco and the president.
That's an interesting point about Ron DeSantis. I mean, what is his long-term thinking now? Do you think he thinks perhaps a Trump second administration flames out and he can come back and say, I was the sensible choice all along?
It's hard to know what he's thinking. I mean, it's very difficult to understand why he didn't campaign actively for the president. He could, I mean, the president was gracious enough to let him speak at the convention, didn't even have to do that. Uh, I would have to say that the governor's speech was most unmemorable, but still, the president, I thought, reached out the olive branch, let him speak. I don't know of any campaign appearances he made. The president campaigned in Florida, but the governor never showed up, and I don't think ever expressed a desire to show up. A smart politician would have fixed this, and he did not do so. So I don't know what's on his mind, or more precisely, what's on his wife's mind, because, well, frankly, I think she's making most of the decisions.
On that note, we will end it there, Roger Stone. But thank you very much for coming on to the Americano podcast. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
That was, again, the man, the myth, the legend, Roger Stone, in another awe-inspiring interview where he provides so much insight and analysis of the players involved, the MAGA movement, and what's happening in real time. Again, I am Mark Vargas, editor-in-chief of Illinois Review, filling in for Roger Stone today, but he will be back tomorrow. I can promise you that. But before we get started, I'd like to talk about just several days after November 22nd, the 61st anniversary of President John F. Kennedy's assassination. I'd like to encourage you all to go to the StoneZONE and get your copy of The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the Case Against LBJ. That's right, the Case Against LBJ, a New York Times bestseller written by the Roger Stone. Why do you want to get this book? Stone maps out the case that LBJ blackmailed his way on the ticket in 1960 and was being dumped in 1964 to face prosecution for corruption at the hands of his nemesis, attorney Robert Kennedy. Stone uses fingerprint evidence and testimony to prove JFK was shot by a longtime LBJ hitman and not Lee Harvey Oswald. President Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, was the driving force behind a conspiracy to murder President Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. Stone has gathered documents and uses firsthand knowledge to construct the ultimate book to prove that LBJ was not only involved in JFK's assassination, but in fact was the mastermind. Again, the man who killed Kennedy. The Case Against LBJ. Go to StoneZONE to get your copy. You can also get a signed copy. And I want to encourage all of you to go and purchase that book today. In other breaking news, and I want to be very clear on this because I am from Chicago, the supposed home of Barack Obama. And what we've learned after November's election is that this Trump's massive mandate and his victory has made the Obama movement completely irrelevant. Think about this. Barack Obama and Michelle spent all of their political capital not only to shove Joe Biden out of the way and appoint Kamala Harris to run in his place, but he orchestrated all of this behind the scenes using Chicago-style, Chicago alderman backroom politics. And what happened? The strategy completely backfired. Again, Obama used all of his political capital, kept saying that Donald Trump and the MAGA movement were a threat, mocked the president, mocked Black and Latino voters who were thinking about voting for President Donald Trump, essentially said that if you're not Black, if you don't vote for Kamala Harris, that she was such a historical figure. And what happened on election night? President Trump won every swing state. He won the popular vote, gaining more votes than any Republican candidate in history. He won the electoral vote, completely embarrassing and humiliating not just Kamala Harris, but the entire Democratic Party establishment. But more importantly, Barack Obama, the biggest loser in this election. But it goes for Obama from bad to worse. Why? Because their entire strategy is completely unraveling. Take, for instance, today, Special Prosecutor Jack Smith has now ended all of the federal investigations of President Trump. That's right. Let's take a look at this clip from earlier today.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day. We're coming on the air with breaking news about President-elect Donald Trump. The Justice Department Special Counsel Jack Smith just filed a motion to dismiss the federal criminal case against the president-elect over his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. The news comes after NBC News learned the Justice Department had been planning to wind down its federal cases against Mr. Trump. It also comes as NBC News learned that Smith and his team plan to resign before Mr. Trump returns to the White House.
Think about that. It's just that easy. Now, my question to Jack Smith and to the Biden-Harris DOJ is, are you going to refund the American people for the millions and millions of dollars that were spent with these fake investigations? There were no crimes. So just as easy it is for Jack Smith to issue these indictments of President Trump, where they literally wanted to put him in prison for over 800 years, he could just say like this, well, I'm going to wrap up my office, I'm going to resign, and we're going to end all of these investigations. After not only destroying lives and livelihoods, costing President Trump tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars that he's had to spend in legal fees, destroying his reputation, character assassination, trying to destroy the reputation of his fine business and his children who work in that business. And at the snap of a finger, Jack Smith can say, it's all over. We're done. Case closed. This is obnoxious considering the how many lives not only Jack Smith, but these investigations have destroyed. And what have they come up with? Absolutely nothing. Think about this. The Mueller investigation, the Mueller witch hunt. It wasn't even an investigation. The Mueller witch hunt. Do you know how much that cost the American people? $32 million. $32 million for essentially Robert Mueller to say there were no crimes. This was a complete hoax. Russia was not trying to, the Trump campaign was not working with Russia to influence the election. This was a made-up story by the mainstream liberal media and by the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign. This story was a complete fraud. And as a result, Americans had to spend $32 million on a sham investigation and a sham appointment. And let's not forget that Jack Smith's appointment was unconstitutional. So this pre-dawn raid on Mar-a-Lago, where they did a photo shoot and laid out all of these documents out on the floor as if President Trump was keeping classified documents out in the open for everyone to see, endangering the lives of Americans. This was completely made up by the Justice Department. And let's not forget that during that raid, where Trump's lawyer wasn't even allowed to be a part of, they had a authorized to use deadly force order. That's right, a shoot to kill order at Mar-a-Lago, one of the most secure residences and resorts in the world. Why? Because it is the home of the 45th and now 47th President of the United States. But this is a very dangerous precedent that was essentially created by the Obama administration to target and harass political opponents. But this has been happening for a long time. Consider all of the people in their wake, innocent individuals in their wake that have been so wrongfully prosecuted and have spent so much money financially, have been brought to ruin. People like our very own Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, Steve Bannon, George Papadopoulos. Think about all of Peter Navarro, Carter Page, all of these names, but not just in the Trump orbit. Let's go all the way back to 2008, 2009 with the wrongful prosecution of Rod Blagojevich. Yes, that's right, the wrongful prosecution of Rod Blagojevich, because they didn't have enough evidence to convict him in the first trial. So what happened? They went to a second trial. The same thing we're seeing happening with President Trump. They will stop at nothing, and they will use all of their resources. They've got unlimited funds to target and harass political enemies. Think about this. Rod Blagojevich was sent to prison for 14 years after they were dangling a life sentence. 14 years for allegedly selling Barack Obama's Senate seat, which later turned out to be a complete lie. And that charge, that conviction, was actually overturned on appeal. And it was called just basic political log rolling. They were discussions. It was never about money. It was never about wire money to this account. It was never like Gold Bar Bob Menendez, where he was hiding gold bars and stacks of cash in his jackets and his shoes. No, that wasn't the case. What Rod Blagojevich was saying is, if I'm going to appoint a senator that Barack Obama wants, then what do I get for it? Will I get support for my health care legislation? Will I get support for transportation projects and roads projects? Where will you help me in terms of the legislative agenda that I've put forth to help everyday Illinoisans? It wasn't about money, but it doesn't matter to these corrupt individuals that really should be the ones going to prison. They sent an innocent man to prison for 14 years on something that was completely a fraud and fake, and no crimes existed. And the remaining fundraising crimes, there were 3. But guess what? These were made by third parties that Rod Blagojevich had no idea that these individuals were making these fundraising requests. And, by the way, completely legal fundraising requests. But they sent a man to prison for 14 years. Fortunately, Trump commuted that sentence after 8. But let's connect the dots. Who was the FBI director at that time? Robert Mueller. Who was the federal prosecutor that was prosecuting Rod Blagojevich? None other than Patrick Fitzgerald. Who's Patrick Fitzgerald? He's James Comey's best friend, the godfather of his children. And also, James Comey has referred to Patrick Fitzgerald as the greatest prosecutor I've ever met in my life. In fact, they worked together in the Southern District of New York and sharpened their legal teeth together. And so, yes, it was Robert Mueller and James Comey's best friend who worked with the Obama administration to put Rod Blagojevich away for 14 years. And now these exact same people have been going after President Trump in a total witch hunt. But victory, because today justice was served and Jack Smith has ended all these investigations. But when are we now going to hold Jack Smith and his team accountable? Accountable for creating crimes and accountable for wasting taxpayer dollars. It's completely outrageous. In other news, the Biden administration, and I'm not making this up, the Biden administration is debating about whether or not to arm Ukraine, with a nuclear weapon, with nuclear weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, this marks a dramatic escalation in the battle in Ukraine against Russia. And what the Biden administration is doing is literally putting the world on the brink of a World War III, on the brink of a nuclear war just months before Trump is set to take office. This is outrageous. This is political malpractice, and this puts the entire world at danger. It is outrageous that this administration, this Biden-Harris administration, would even consider arming Ukraine with nuclear weapons. This will no doubt lead to a nuclear war against nuclear world powers, and there are going to be no winners. Again, this is yet more proof of the dangers that the Biden administration has created, not just for Americans here at home, but for Americans and our allies abroad. And again, what does the ICC criminal court want to do? They want to imprison one of our greatest allies. There's been an arrest warrant, as you know, issued for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his top generals. But it doesn't end there. Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah, has now gone a step further, and he is now calling for Prime Minister Netanyahu's execution. Not just an arrest warrant for crimes against humanity, but yes, Iran's supreme leader is now calling for the execution of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's remarkable how people seem to think, particularly those anti-Israeli people within today's Democratic Party, that they forget about the nearly 1,200 innocent babies, children, young adults, teenagers, moms, dads, grandfathers and grandmothers, aunts and uncles that were brutally murdered on October 7th. Many still held hostage, including Americans who still to this day, November 25th, are still being held hostage. And what does key members within the Democratic Party want to do? They don't want to embrace one of our strongest allies, and one of our strongest allies in the global war on terrorism in terms of protecting American interests and Americans and allies abroad. No, they don't want to stand next to or beside our ally, Israel. No, they want to attack them. They want to show support for Gaza and Hamas and make the Israelis the terrorists instead of the terrorists who are the terrorists. Does this sound familiar? This is exactly what's happening in our major cities across the country that are run by Democrats. These soft on crime policies that have continued to criminalize the victims and victimize the criminals. This is no different. This is why we've seen a significant spike in crime in these Democratic-controlled cities like Chicago. And we've seen this spike even before the southern border was opened and millions and millions of illegals have poured into our country. And as a result, we've seen spikes in crime, not just in New York and San Francisco and Chicago and these Democratic-controlled cities, these sanctuary cities, where we've seen 11,000% increase in arrests in Venezuelans, where we've seen an increase in carjackings, we've seen increases in armed robberies. In fact, we have international gangs that are where wars are about to erupt between international gangs and local gangs in places like Chicago, where these international gangs, these Venezuelan gangs that are very violent and dangerous and vicious, have set up shop, that have said, this is our community, this is our block, these are our housing units, these are our apartment buildings, while the local gangs who have been there for decades, for generations, are saying, no, 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 no. This is our land. This is our home. We're the legal residents here. You're the illegal migrants. Get off our land. Get off our property. And as a result, we're going to see an explosion in terms of gang wars amongst city gangs and international Venezuelan gangs. And who can we thank for this? We can thank Biden-Harris policies. We can also thank Biden-Harris policies for the rise in the cost of groceries. We're going to put out a slide here on the cost of groceries across the country. Average cost of groceries for Americans is $270. And that is why people believe that will Trump make food and grocery prices go down? 44% say yes. Only 35% say it'll go up, and 21% said it won't change. That 21% doesn't have an IQ, but 44% says yes. And the answer is yes. The Trump administration will drive down costs because the cost of groceries is literally destroying middle-class America. And again, who do we have to thank for this? Biden and Harris regime. Who else do we have to thank? Not only for these open borders that have made our communities more dangerous, where gangs and international gangs are on the breach of a massive war, where economy is destroyed, gas prices have skyrocketed, groceries have skyrocketed. For the first time, grandmothers in their 70s and 80s are having to go back to work places like grocery stores to bag groceries. Why? Because they can no longer afford to live on their retirement, on their Social Security check. So they've got to go back to work. Not only do we have to thank the Biden-Harris regime for that, but let's look overseas. Let's look what's happening in Ukraine and in Russia. Let's look what's happening in Israel and Hamas, how Iran is involved. Let's talk about the withdrawal in Afghanistan that cost the lives of American service members. And as a result, the terrorists, the Taliban, now have billions and billions of dollars of U.S. grade military equipment. And for the first time, the Taliban can fight at night. You ask why can the Taliban now fight at night? Because the Biden-Harris regime left our high-powered, extremely classified night vision goggles. And again, now they can fight at night. But think about all of how these Biden-Harris policies have completely destroyed our country. And what are we hearing now? I'm not making this up. Kamala Harris, after spending a little bit of vacation time in Hawaii with their family and working the phones, Kamala Harris, after just completely getting destroyed on November 5th, is now thinking about running for president again in 2028. And in fact, polling suggests that she may even be the front runner for the Democratic nomination in 2028. Not only is she thinking about a future presidential run here in 4 years, but at the same time, she's also debating whether or not she runs for governor of California. But we all know that her eyes are set not on the governorship of California, but on the presidency, as if she hasn't learned anything after the November 5th election, where everyday Americans, hardworking Americans, union working Americans, Black Americans, Latino Americans, all rejected her policies. But that's not going to stop Harris from wanting to be president again. And that's certainly not stopping her allies, like U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth, a Democrat and war veteran, from criticizing Trump cabinet nominees. And again, the American people voted President Trump into office because they trust his judgment. They trust the names that he's going to put forward for his cabinet, and they're all terrific names. That's not going to stop them from criticizing. And think about this. Tammy Duckworth is criticizing Secretary of Defense nominee Pete Hegseth, saying he's not qualified. I think we've got a clip of this. Let's play this.
America's daughters are just as capable of defending liberty and freedom as her sons.
Having served in combat yourself, what do you think of the idea that women make fighting more complicated? That was specifically what he focused on.
Well, it just shows his lack of understanding of where our military is. You know, he was a pretty low-ranking guy in the military, and he never had a command position. He was a platoon leader, I think, once or twice, but he never even commanded a company. And so this is a man who is inordinately unqualified for the position. Remember that the Pentagon is 3 million servicemen and women and civilians. It is a over $900 billion budget. He's never, run anything anywhere near to that size. And frankly, women actually make our military more effective. And I personally found that I brought many insights to my job when I was a company commander, when I was a logistics officer, that came from my own personal background that made things better. I took better care of my men for.
To say that Pete Hegseth isn't qualified. The man served multiple tours in war. He's received many brave accommodations and medals for his service in combat, and yet he's not qualified. The last time I checked, Pete Hegseth outranks Tammy Duckworth. But let's think about the nominees, the secretaries of defense that Tammy Duckworth and the Democrats, and in fact, some of these rhino Republicans, let's talk about some of those secretaries of defense that they supported. Let's start with a guy named Donald Rumsfeld, a lapdog to Dick Cheney, who was part of that conspiracy to lie about there being weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And what happened? We went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan under Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Every defense secretary, from Ash Carter of President Barack Obama, his defense secretaries, what did they all do? They exacerbated the wars in Iraq. Do you know how much money that Americans have spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? You're not even going to guess. $18 trillion. And what did these secretaries of defense under George W. Bush and Barack Obama do? They exacerbated the war. They allowed billions and billions and billions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse. In Iraq alone, $8 billion was literally handed over to the country of Iraq, and they have no accountability of where that money went. I can tell you where it went. It went into the pockets and into the bank accounts of government officials and business leaders. Literally billions and billions of dollars in cash on pallets dropped off. And what happened? $8 billion alone in Iraq are missing. Think about all the billions and billions of dollars that are missing in Afghanistan. But $18 trillion. Is this the type of defense secretary that they want to applaud? Defense secretaries that cost Americans trillions and trillions of dollars, that cost American lives, civilian lives. We've got service members that are severely injured and will live with long-term disabilities because of going to a war that we didn't win. What happened in Afghanistan and Iraq? We didn't win. There were no winners. And yet it took Donald Trump to end the wars, to start bringing American soldiers back, to say America first. We're not going to be spending this money overseas on wars we can't win. We're going to be spending this money here at home to make our citizens' lives better. And so what does Pete Hegseth want to do? He wants to support our military. He doesn't want to go to war. He wants to end wokeism. That's what he wants to do. And as a result, Tammy Duckworth and her Democratic friends oppose his nomination. But I'm for President Trump and his nominees, and together we will make America great again. Thank you for watching. I'm Mark Vargas, editor-in-chief of Illinois Review. Roger Stone will be back with you tomorrow. God bless you, good night, and God bless America.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's